Hi everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Sagi and I am the coordinator for English medium instruction at Ben Gurion. And in this little recording and little one-sided workshop, I want to talk a little about the place that Hebrew has in a course that is taught in English. So what we're going to do is talk about three main things in this regard. We're going to talk about when Hebrew may or may not be used in general. We'll talk about why we might want to use Hebrew. And we'll talk about how to integrate Hebrew into a lesson in English if you choose to do so. So we'll start with the when and address the English reform in academia, get a sense of what this reform is all about. So just for general knowledge, the English reform in academia says that each student has to take at least one course in English from their own department. An additional course can be either another course in English from their department or one of the English language courses, advanced 2, basically. So in any case, each student will have to take at least one course in English. And if you teach one of those courses in English, there are certain rules that apply in the current reform. I will also say that this reform is in an experimental temporary stage, so these things may change later, but at least for the upcoming year, what I will say remains relevant. So when do we use English? So if you teach an English medium course, a course in English, the lectures must be in English. Okay, or at least mostly in English. So the lecture is non-negotiable. What is negotiable is what happens around the lecture. For example, assignments or papers may be in English or in Hebrew or in both. You can ask your students to submit in English or in Hebrew. You can ask them to submit in any one of these languages if you wish, or if you can read and grade and feel comfortable working with both. And tutorials also don't have to be in English. In each of these cases, with assignments, papers, tutorials, and of course that includes exams as well, the choice is yours. You may choose to have them in English, you may choose to have them in Hebrew, you may choose to have them in both. You, the lecturer, the conductor of the course, you make the choice. I do recommend thinking about the implications about these choices. For example, if everything is taught in English, would it be wiser to have the assignments and exams in English? Or if everything's done in English, would it be wiser to have the tutorial in the same language or have a tutorial in Hebrew so that students may find some kind of balance? In any case, it's in your hands, the lecturers, the professors. However, there is one caveat, and that is foreign students. One of the catalysts for the reform is the desire to have more foreign students join the university. And if you have a foreign student in class, meaning a student who probably doesn't speak Hebrew at all, then all of these choices do not apply. You cannot have assignments, papers, and tutorials in Hebrew if you have a foreign student registered who does not speak Hebrew. So if you have one or more foreign students who don't speak Hebrew in your classroom, then of course you have to have English options for everything, because those students will not be able to engage with the Hebrew. So it's very important when you get the student list for your course and make decisions about how the course will be run, make sure to check, are there foreign students registered? Because that may change the amount of choices and the use of Hebrew in that particular classroom. But generally speaking, for most cases, a lot of these choices are in your hands, and you can make your decisions based on what's best for you and for your students. But let me say, and this is what most of the rest of this little lecture will be about, it's still okay to use some Hebrew even in the lecture, as long as that is used productively and cautiously. And what we'll see in what follows is what it means to use Hebrew productively and cautiously. What are the options for using Hebrew without turning an English course into a Hebrew course? So let's start with the why. Why would we choose to sometimes use Hebrew in the classroom? So the first thing for which Hebrew is very useful is to review previous material, especially from previous courses. Why? Because most of your students, or all of your students, still study most of their degree in Hebrew. So whatever other materials they have encountered in previous courses, in their at home, in some other contexts, they are likely to have encountered them in Hebrew. So when you put a little bit of Hebrew into reviews, and I say a little bit because, as we'll see later, it really has to be used cautiously. If you put a little bit of Hebrew into a review of previous materials, you're in fact giving your students a chance to connect their ideas to what they already know, and they don't have to learn new terms from the very beginning, in a way. The second thing that Hebrew can be useful for is to present key concepts. Not all the concepts, not most of them, but key concepts. It's good to use Hebrew in addition to English. Again, we'll see how it's done, but key concepts, words, notions, ideas that you know are going to be extremely central, and you want to be 100% certain that your students get them and get their importance, Hebrew may be added to help clarify, to help keep everyone on the same page. Again, we'll see how to do it in a few moments. The last thing, of course, and it's related to presenting ideas, you may also want to use Hebrew occasionally to clarify ideas. Some ideas, some theories, some equations, some materials are very difficult. They include a lot of verbiage, a lot of words or many terms. Sometimes they include a lot of moving parts, and you may want to occasionally clarify your ideas by adding a little bit of Hebrew here and there. And clarify also applies to students. When students speak, or when there is a discussion or some kind of question and answer dynamic in the classroom, it may also be useful to play around with Hebrew. Again, we'll see how it's done cautiously, so the lesson doesn't turn into a Hebrew one. But all of these, in all of these cases, Hebrew may be useful rather than a hindrance. I do want to clarify, though, that even though using Hebrew in these cases may be useful, it can only be used in addition to English. In other words, not instead of, not switching to review materials or present terms only in Hebrew, but, as we will see, add Hebrew to the English in order to make things clearer. Okay, so always Hebrew in addition to, never instead of English, because according to the terms of the reform, The lecture must be in English. And of course, again, if you have foreign students present, then you have to be extra careful about how much Hebrew you use. The basic idea behind all of these uses of Hebrew is making connections. It's not about making it easier on the students. It's not about translating for them. The idea is, again, your students most likely think and study in Hebrew most of the time. So when you occasionally introduce Hebrew here and there in the ways that we'll see later, it helps the students make connections between what they already know and what you are teaching them, between what they've studied in previous courses and what happens in a given course. It helps negotiate terminology that may be relevant across courses, but comes out in different languages and may be confusing. It's really about helping students put the pieces together in their head, not about making it easy on them, not about translating for them, not about getting them to ignore English. It's about helping them make better connections by using all the available cognitive resources at our disposal, and two languages are resources that are better off than one. Now let's talk about the how. The how refers to what we can do to use Hebrew in this mild yet productive yet cautious manner. Okay, so how can we use Hebrew to help us run English speaking classes? The first thing you can do, even before a lesson or a course starts, is offer a glossary. A glossary is really just a list of terms that help students understand the basic words. Now, a glossary can have many forms, but in this case, the best way to do this would be to offer a glossary that simply has the key central terms you know your students have to have in their mental arsenal. So these kinds of terms can be offered in a glossary. Now, you can prepare a glossary before the beginning of a course, and then you'll have this basic document to which students may refer throughout the course. Or if you're extra diligent, you may offer occasional glossaries for each lecture. It's a lot of work, but it's definitely a possibility. The basic idea of a glossary is that key terms, important words, not everything, important words, key terms, ideas that the students need to know and understand regardless of their linguistic capabilities, may be offered to begin with so that students can both understand what the words mean, and when they hear them, they may be able to track them. Now, one of the complaints I occasionally received about glossaries is that students sometimes don't look at them, and that is the student's choice. But you may want to give those students who do want to use it an opportunity, and it's also a way to know that you've done everything that you can to help students with their school. So glossaries may be helpful if you want some kind of overall understanding of terms. The second thing that the second way in which Hebrew can be integrated into the lesson is simply add them to presentations. Again, when you prepare a presentation, sometimes you have a lot of images and a lot of verbiage and all sorts of different slides and different topics. But you, as the lecturer, as the professor, know which words, which ideas, which topics are super important. So one of the things you can do is simply add a little bit of Hebrew into the presentation or the presentation slides when important words or key terms appear. As in the example here, for example, if I want to talk about let's say power and sociology, and say that it's intersubjective, and that it's intersubjective because it depends on discourse and on practices, I may wish to put after intersubjective discourse and practices the Hebrew translation for the word. For two reasons. One, it may help students understand these important words in case they do not know what they mean. And secondly, in case, let's say, they are sociology students or political science students or literature students, they may have heard or they may hear these terms repeated again in courses that are not English courses. So it's important that they know what these words mean in Hebrew so that they can make the connection between what they've studied before and what they study now, or what they study now and what comes in later courses. Again, this method is especially useful because it doesn't require a lot of work. You just take your presentation, you find the ideas that you think are the most central. It's a nice way to prepare for a class anyway. And wherever you feel that there's a term that the students have to know or have to be able to use or have to be familiar with from either this course or another course, put a little Hebrew translation next to it. Of course, the methods are not mutually exclusive. You may offer a glossary at the beginning of the course and occasionally put translations into the presentations. This is also a nice method because if you have foreign students in your course, it doesn't interfere with their presence doesn't interfere. I mean, everything is still in English and the Hebrew is for the Hebrew speakers. So both the glossary and the addition of Hebrew to the presentations can be done regardless of what kind of students you may have. But it's important to put these translations in your presentations because, and I'm saying this with a tinge of sadness, but unfortunately, some of your students may be very, very weak in English. They may just be at the beginning of their English studies at the university in the Matchilim courses, the beginners courses in English. So these little additions may help these students have some ability to follow what's going on, even if their English is very weak. At least they'll know what to focus on and what are the important terms. Another interesting way to use Hebrew in the classroom, which requires much less work from you, the professors, and puts a lot more of the effort on the students, but at the same time also helps induce participation, is simply ask students for translations. Again, not translations of everything, not translations of every word, but occasionally when an important term comes up, when you use an example or a central idea or an idea that's been studied before in the course or in other courses, you may turn to the students and simply ask them, what does it mean? Okay, do you remember what is the meaning of discourse? Do you remember what is the meaning of integer? Can anyone just remind us how we say corroboration in Hebrew? Okay, it's a good method. It helps the students participate. It keeps them awake. It also creates a little more effort in terms of the English. It's a very nice method. Again, you don't use it for everything. You use it for terms, ideas, and notions that are super important. But if you feel like working too hard on a glossary and the presentation may not be a possibility or may not be enough, using the students, one of your most important resources in the classroom, is a great way to make sure that what happens in English gets passed on in Hebrew, but then the burden is not on you, it passes partially to the students. By the way, one of the reasons this is a great method is also because I know that this little presentation is about Hebrew, but we need to remember that we also have students who are speakers or native speakers of other languages, such as, let's say, Arabic or Russian. So in case an important term comes up and you want to make sure that everyone understands it, this may also be a great way to help those students who need the Arabic term or the Russian term or the Chinese term for that matter. And because you don't have to know these languages, you can ask the students to translate to their friends, and you may actually even learn a few words along the way. So this is a great method to both make sure everyone understands and work your students, and maybe even give a little opportunity for students to do some bonding. The last thing is not so much about when you should use Hebrew, but when Hebrew is sort of foisted on you. What sometimes happens in classrooms is that students choose to ask questions or make comments in Hebrew. This may be because they don't know English enough. This may be because they're more comfortable using Hebrew. And again, generally, when the students normally think in Hebrew, it's much more difficult to phrase questions and ideas in English. So students often tend to ask their questions in class in Hebrew, and they're allowed to do so. You may encourage them to use English, but they're allowed to ask in Hebrew. It's better than not asking at all. In this case, what's important to do is to make sure that even though the student uses Hebrew, you give the English version to the students. In other words, let's say a student asks, רגע, אז ההסתברות היא פונקציה של, okay, before answering the question, as the lecturer, you may want to say first, before answering, okay, so you're asking if the probability is a function of, okay, really just repeat the question back to the student in English. Now, it's important to note you're repeating the question both to the particular student who asks it, because then you are helping that student hear how his question would sound in English. It helps students sort of think and phrase themselves in English. And it helps because if you have other students in the class for whom Hebrew is not a native language or who are foreign students, then everyone still understands the question. Try avoiding answering a question immediately. If a student asks a question in Hebrew and you immediately jump to answer it, then first of all, the student has not learned anything in English. And secondly, students who are less capable of using Hebrew may miss the questions and lose interest. By repeating the question in English, you offer both the students, the student who makes the question, a way of kind of hearing how he would sound in English, and the rest of the class keep track. It's of course true with comments, not just with questions. For example, if a student makes a comment about a similarity between a topic and something else, like יש את מלחמת האזרחים בסוריה עכשיו, זה ממש דומה. Again, instead of immediately responding, you may want to first let the other students and that particular student hear the question, the comment in English, to help them hear how it would sound. So just before answering, just say like, great, the Civil War in Syria is very similar to whatever it is we're studying. And then you can go on and make additional comments. Okay, again, it's a great way to cover all the bases. It helps students understand how their questions may sound in English, and it helps students for whom English is the primary language keep in touch even if Hebrew is used in the classroom. And of course, the fact that Hebrew may be used and may be used in this way doesn't mean that you should just let students speak Hebrew. Encourage them to use English. Encourage means gently. Try asking in English. You can use a few words in Hebrew, but try using most words in English. Anything that works. Whenever a student does ask in English, you can make an extra effort to praise that student, like great question or nice English or something like that, just to make students see that using English is not a punishment that they need to find ways to avoid, but that it's okay, it's not scary. And I would like to remind you, and you may want to remind your students, that English is not a language a language only for these courses. This is the language that they're very likely be forced to use in conferences, at work, and other situations. So being able to use English in professional contexts is important for them. And a classroom where they have nothing to lose by playing around with the language a little bit is a great place to practice. Now, a little warning after all these suggestions. Even though the purpose here was to really help the students, I want to emphasize that using Hebrew once in a while for important ideas or for student interaction may be fine, but avoid switching to Hebrew completely or trying to translate too many of your sentences, or avoid using Hebrew all the time because you're afraid that people don't understand. The reason you shouldn't do this is because once students notice that Hebrew is widely used, they stop trying and then they switch to Hebrew completely. Okay? I think not just students, I think we're all as human beings, we tend to instantly grab onto whatever shortcuts that are available to us. And students are no different. Once they see that they can use Hebrew and use it a lot, or demand translations, or that everything you say will be later translated, they'll get used to it, they'll learn to rely on it, and then you won't be able to stop, or they won't actually be taking an English language course or an English medium course, but it will just be a mishmash of Hebrew and English with no purpose. So that's why I began by saying that Hebrew may be used if it's used productively in the ways we've seen, by ways of glossary, by way of adding it to presentations, by asking students from translations, by repeating student comments. And it has to be used cautiously. Don't overuse Hebrew, because first of all, it contradicts the notions of the reform, and then you're doing something that you shouldn't. And secondly, because you're not doing your students any favors by letting them believe that they don't need the English at all. They can just use Hebrew. So when you do choose to use Hebrew, make sure you choose wisely, and that your students also notice that Hebrew is used when absolutely necessary and important, and not all the time or whenever they want. I'll give an interesting example. One of the professors in another college, not at Ben Gurion, once told me that they have a problem because the students keep asking them to translate everything they say. And this is exactly one of these results of translating too much. Once the professor is trying to be nice and translate once or twice or 5 or 6 times, the students suddenly expect that as a given. And that shouldn't be the case. It's still an English medium course, and the purpose of it is for students to make an effort and understand the English. So that's it for this very brief but hopefully useful introduction to using Hebrew as part of an English medium classroom. If you have any other questions, if you need any help, if you wonder whether something is allowed or not allowed, whatever you need, you have my information here, my email, my phone number. You can also contact the Teaching Center, היחידה לקידום הוראה, and they will find me for you. Thank you very much.